Let's go through today how I go about drawing eyes. It is such a satisfying process, but it can feel tricky to make them look as realistic as possible. Now, I want to show you today the materials that I used to create this eye, as well as the considerations that I put in before I started drawing. I can then show you the full process I used to create this eye. So let's start off by talking about the materials. And the most obvious material that we'll need is some pencils. For this drawing, I used 3 different graphite pencils. Because I want the eye and the skin around it to look as rich as possible, I don't just shade with one pencil. I like using a hard or light pencil, a medium and a soft or dark pencil to create that richness. And generally speaking, I would use an HB, a 3B and a 6B to do this. Now for this particular drawing, I actually used something called matte graphite pencils rather than standard graphite. This type of pencil doesn't have that reflective shine you see on normal graphite. So with matte graphite, they're on a slightly different scale. I used a 4B, 8B and 12B. But basically, as long as you have a hard, medium and soft pencil, that will be fine. Next up, we need some paper. And to draw this eye, I didn't use sketch paper or printer paper. It's not going to be possible to build up the depth on that kind of paper. I used something called Bristol board. This is a really nice and smooth paper. It's also very thick like card, and that enables me to be able to build up all of the graphite. A couple of quick items now. I need a pencil sharpener to create really nice and sharp points, and some tissue. This will be to blend the pencil. You'll see a bit later how I use this. Next up, I use 2 different types of eraser, and I use both of these erasers for 2 different purposes. First up, I like using a putty eraser. This is a moldable eraser. You can mold it into all sorts of shapes. It's great for just lifting a little bit of the graphite off the paper. I've also got an electric eraser. This is amazing for adding in fine details. Next up, I need a ruler, and I'll show you in a short while what I use this for. And finally, I need some way of looking at the reference photo. Now, I'll talk about the reference photo more in a second, but every drawing that I create, I always work from a reference. I need some way of looking at that reference. Now, I like using my iPad. I particularly like that I can zoom in to see all of the details, but you don't need an iPad, just any way of looking at the reference. Before I go any further, please do hit the subscribe button if you're finding this helpful. That'll help you be notified for all of my future videos. So now let's talk about the reference photo. As I mentioned, I always use a reference photo for every one of my drawings. I find this is absolutely key for creating a realistic eye. I think particularly with things like eyes, people make a lot of assumptions on what's where, what shape things are. Working from a reference photo allows you to actually see what's there and draw what you see rather than what you imagine. Now, there are a few things that I am looking for in a reference photo. First up, if I'm drawing an eye, the most important thing beyond all others is that the eye has amazing contrast. I want to have a good amount of lights, darks, and midtones. If I try and draw something that is just all midtones, it's not going to look very interesting at the end. I also personally generally like drawing eyes that are looking at the camera, and I also keep a bit of an eye out for any reflections that I think will look weird when they're drawn. But the most important thing is having a reference photo with that contrast. Once I've selected a reference photo, I then need to make my sketch. This is so important. If the sketch is wrong to begin with, you could do absolutely amazing shading and it's never going to look right. So to create my sketches, I like using something called the grid method. This is where I draw a grid on my drawing paper and a grid on my reference photo, and I only draw what's in each individual square. So I generally look at where the lines I'm sketching cross the edges of the box, and then I match that up. This stops me from making any of those assumptions. It forces me to draw what's in each square. It kind of means that you're not drawing an eye anymore, you're just drawing a series of shapes. If there's a particularly fiddly section, I can always create a smaller grid, or if it's a very simple series of shapes, I can build a bigger grid. Once I've mapped in all of my shapes on the sketch, I can then erase the grid lines. Now note that when I'm doing this, I do this as lightly as possible. I want to have such light sketch lines at the end that it's not going to show through on the drawing. drawing. On the sketch that I've made here, I have done all the lines quite hard for the camera just so you can see them. But you want it to be so much lighter than this or you'll still see the sketch at the end. So now that's all of the preparation done for the eye. Before we go through the process of adding in some of the shading, if you want to go through this with me in a lot more detail, I do have a full tutorial available. In fact, I have loads of tutorials on all sorts of different subjects in not only graphite pencils, but also colored pencils and watercolor pencils. For each and every tutorial, I include really in-depth instructions, all of the real-time footage, details of all of the materials I'm using, the sketch outlines in case you don't want to make your own, and the reference photo. I have some nice and fast drawings like this, for example, and then some much longer, more impressive drawings. I also have a good mix of drawings and of full courses, which are particularly good if you're a beginner. Check out the link in the description. So let's start adding some shading onto this eye, and I want to start off with the hardest pencil. Now with this hardest pencil, literally all I want to do is map in the main shapes. Working from the shapes that I've already got marked in on my sketch, I just want to get my bearings on what needs to go where. And the most important thing when I'm doing this is that I want to work really nice and lightly. Even in areas that I do eventually want to be very dark and heavy, I don't want to do that at the moment. I want to be pressing lightly, and that's in time going to build up the richness that I want to add on this drawing. Now I'll talk a bit more about how I press lightly in a second, but for now let's just take a minute to look at some of the shapes here. Now as I say, I am literally just looking at the shapes that I can see on my reference photo and the shapes that I've already marked in on my sketch, and all I'm trying to do is get both of these things a little bit clearer. So on the pupil here, for example, I'm just working around some of the lighter patches that, as I say, I've already marked in from my sketch, and I'm just trying to make the main shapes as accurate as possible. So I'm marking in some of the shapes within this light patch. You can see there's a reflection of some eyelashes here, but I'm not focusing on drawing those eyelashes. I think that would be very tricky. I am literally just drawing what I can see, which is some kind of rough stripes going through this box, and that is it. Around the iris here, I am looking at the shapes. I can see there is some darker patches that are going from the pupil towards the darker edge of the eye, and I'm just trying to get them roughly marked out where they're going to need to go. I don't need to get it perfect, but I am trying very much to look at what will need to go where. Now as I'm doing this, this is a good example of how I'm going about pressing lightly. I want to focus on putting down the pencil lightly and nice and smoothly. So first up, you'll see that I'm working in kind of circular motions rather than just scribbling back and forth. I find that if I work in these little circles, the pencil goes down in a much smoother, less scribbly way. I'm also working with a really nice and sharp pencil. I find it again goes down much more consistently when it is nice and sharp. I also, generally speaking, hold the pencil further back than you might expect. Rather than always holding the pencil really close to the tip, if I hold the pencil back here, it stops me from being able to press too hard. Now you'll notice that there are times that I do hold it closer to the tip, but I am still pressing lightly. It is possible to press lightly when holding the pencil closer. It's just you've got to have a bit more pencil control. So it's just a little extra something to think about. So let's think about some of the misconceptions that I think people make when drawing eyes. So first up, around the edge of the pupil, it isn't as sharp and crisp of a line as you might expect. You'll see what I've already drawn in here is actually very faded. It's very much blending into the iris. And actually I would say the same for the dark line around the edge of the iris. Is actually much sort of hazier and blurrier than people would expect. Also note, as I'm drawing in the white of the eye here, this is also much darker than people imagine. In fact, in some of the corners on this white of the eye, they are extremely dark. Although the white of the eye is generally considered white. Because it's a curved shape, it's got the same shadows as anything else. But if we focus on drawing in what can be seen here, it will all look right at the end. So notice that I am still pressing really lightly. Look how lightly I'm pressing here. And quite quickly, I've got the main shape of the eyes here. So let's start mapping in some of the shapes of the eyelids, starting off here with what I've already marked in from my sketch. And then I'm just focusing on where the lights and darks are. So generally speaking, it's more shadowed towards the crease. It's also generally more shadowed towards the lash line and then lighter towards the middle. Now I am also just going to add in a few of the folds on the eye here. There's a few kind of details in this area, and I'm literally just going to draw the shapes that I can see here. I don't need to get it perfect. This is going to be, to a degree, covered by eyelashes. And if I add them in at this point, then it'll all get a little bit nicely blurred once it's been blended. So you can see here how far back I'm holding the pencil to try and get this as smoothly as possible. The skin is probably, I would say, the most important part for getting this down really lightly. I want the skin to be as smooth as is possible. And I'm not going to worry on the eyebrow at this point about adding any hairs. I'm just going to focus on smoothly putting down more shading where the eyebrow is darker and less where it's lighter, and that is it. And then let's start moving on to the bottom of the eye. Always do take note that we want to add in that waterline underneath the eye. Now, if you are focusing on drawing from a reference photo and focusing on what you can see, this will happen anyway. You will end up drawing it in because you can see it. But I often see people not adding it in. And also note how dark actually the shading is under the eye here. Again, because of the shadows that are around the eye. Now you'll note that at this point, I'm not drawing in any of the lashes. We'll be adding those in the next section with the next pencil. For now, I just want to get smooth shading down. So quite quickly, I have created something that looks roughly like an eye. It's kind of a more detailed version of my sketch, I guess. What I now want to do is blend all of this so it doesn't look as scratchy and it looks nice and soft. So what I'm going to do is take a tissue and I'm just going to wrap it around my finger and then use this to create circular motions and blend everything. Now I'm pressing still really nice and lightly. I don't want to be pressing hard here or it's just going to end up smudging everything together. But I do anticipate that this is going to create a more smudged version than what I've already got. And that's okay. I just want to have this really smooth sort of underdrawing that I can start building off of. So I'm going to keep working in these circular motions until everything looks really nice and smooth and it's not looking as grainy anymore. And then I can do exactly the same thing with the mid-tone pencil. So this is now all far easier because I have already marked out what is going where. So I'm once again going over all of those kind of lines that I can see within the iris, trying my best to follow what I can see in the reference photo, but I don't need to get it perfect, as I've said before. Still working nice and lightly. I'm still working in circular motions to try and make this as smooth as possible. And I am literally doing the same as I did before. It just looks darker because it is a softer pencil. So you can see I'm still holding the pencil really far back here. I'm still working in circular motions and how nicely this pencil is going down because of that. Now you'll notice that at this point I haven't added in any eyebrow hairs. I've just gone over the shading that's underneath the eyebrow. I am actually going to add that in a second. But initially I have just mapped in those same shapes that I did originally on the eye. So let's focus a little bit on this eyebrow. And you'll see that what I'm doing here is gently brushing my pencil against the paper in order to make really nice and light marks. I don't want to be pressing hard against the paper because then I'll create wiry marks. That's not what I'm going for. And I'm particularly bearing in mind a few things on this eyebrow. Firstly, I'm looking at the direction of the hairs. The hairs don't all just travel from the left to the right. Generally speaking, a lot of them are actually sticking upwards. I want to try and imitate the direction of these hairs. I'm also particularly looking at the length of the hairs. On the most part, I would say they're all pretty much the same length, but I want to be really focusing on making flicks of that correct length. Now it does look a little bit odd, the eyebrows at this point, but that's okay. We will build more colors up and it will look better. Let's also add in the eyelashes here. And I'm particularly looking at the direction of the eyelashes. So again, I think it's often assumed that the eyelashes on the top here just point straight up, but they don't. First up, for this lady that I'm drawing, her eyelashes, she's wearing mascara, so they're kind of a bit more clumped together than you maybe would expect. So I'm focusing on drawing what I can see with that, but I'm also noticing that generally speaking, they curve towards the outer corners. So towards the middle, they're going a bit more straight up, but around either side, they're curving out in different direction. I'm also noticing on these bottom eyelashes that they're shorter towards the left and longer towards the right. So that's what I'm going to draw in. You'll see that these are looking a little bit wiry at this point, but that is okay. Once I've finished with this second pencil, when I've got to the point that it is looking like an eye, it can feel a bit counterintuitive, but I am once again going to blend this with the tissue. Still in circular motions, still nice and lightly. And then let's do the exact same thing with the softest pencil. This is the darkest pencil. And look at how much richer this looks in comparison to what it looked like when I just went in with that first pencil. So even at this point, I'm not done. I can still add in extra richness and extra blending. Now you may have noticed that because I have blended this with the tissue a few times, some of the areas that I do want to be a really bright white are not currently looking that bright, but that's okay. We can fix that in a second. So I'm once again going through the exact same process, making more flicking motions on the eyebrows. I built up all of the shading with those circular motions again, and I'm still just focusing on getting the lights and darks mapped in. Once I'm happy with this softest pencil, I'm once again going to move on to the tissue, blending this one final time, but you'll see that I'm really doing this quite lightly and delicately now. The softer the pencil, the more smudgy it can be, but I do think it looks a bit grainy before it's blended. So by the time that I've built up these 3 layers, I have quite a smudgy eye. What I can now do is use the combination of both the putty eraser and the electric eraser to add all of those light areas back in. So the putty eraser is amazing for blending into a shape and then just lightly lifting a little bit of the pencil. So you can see here, I'm just making the white of the eye to start with and the eyelid just a little bit lighter. So along the skin on here, for example, you can see I'm just dabbing that eraser, and I can do the same on this corner of the eye around here. I'm also going to just dab the eraser around some of the iris just to brighten that up in between those darker patches. But you'll see this isn't a hugely precise way of adding the light areas back in, but I'm not using it in areas where I do need to be extremely precise. For areas where I do need that precision, that's where this electric eraser is really good. So for adding in the white on the eye here, where I want it to be a really bright white, and as I say, be really precise, that's what I would use this for. It does create some quite sharp, crisp lines, but they can be tidied up in a short while. And actually I can use this to add in all sorts of details. So add in some light patches on the eye where the skin has a bit more texture, like you can see me adding these dots in here, or I can use it for adding in some lighter areas on the eyelashes. So just any area that needs to be lightened up, I can use a combination of these 2 erasers. So once I get to the point that I've added all of the light areas back in with the erasers, after this point, I don't want to blend again with the tissue. If I blend after this point, it's just going to undo all of the work that I did with that eraser. So whilst knowing I'm not going to blend it again, I'm going to go back to the softest pencil. So this is the 12B pencil, to add in any final details. So for example, I can add some extra shading, particularly around here where I know the skin needs to be a lot darker. I can also really really build up the eye, particularly the pupil and around the edge of the iris, making sure that I keep a really soft edge around both. You'll see that I'm still not pressing really hard here. I'm still pressing lightly, but going over the area multiple times that I want to be made darker is what creates that really nice rich shading. And again, this is all made so easy because I've already built up such thorough and detailed templates. I'm just going over the same thing again and again with these different pencils. Now I also want to be adding more details into the eyebrow up the top, adding flicking motions once again. And I'm just generally working through here one area at a time. I think it helps towards the end to take a minute to have a step back to see any other areas that needs that extra shading. And then that is the end of this drawing. That is how I've gone about creating this realistic drawing of an eye. The most important thing is building up all of the layers of the different graphite pencils to create that nice and rich color. Now remember, if you want to go through this with me in a lot more detail, I do have a full tutorial on it. And if you generally want to go through the process that I use for all of my graphite drawings, I have a full video explaining it here. Happy drawing, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.